Welcome to this webinar on financing renewable energy, to the idea of being to build back better. Is this a window of opportunity or not? And we're focusing on India-UK collaborations that may emerge. My name's Emma Maudsley. I'm the director of the Margaret Anstey Centre at Newnham College, Cambridge, and I'm also running the India-UK Development Partnership Forum, which is funded by the FCDO. Needless to say, all views expressed here by myself and anyone else are independent of the FCDO. And we are interested in how India and the UK can learn from each other, collaborate, and in other ways enhance global development, regional development, and development partnerships. So we're really intensely grateful in this now webinar saturated world to be able to welcome Kanika Chawla, who is at the Council on Energy, Environment and Water, and specifically the Director of the Centre for Energy Finance. She is going to chair today's webinar with skill and aplomb, humour and cervic sharpness to draw out our speakers. We have Professor Pete Newell, who is in international relations at the University of Sussex and an enormous figure in climate change, politics, science, energy, and really wonderful to see him. And particular thanks to Amal Lee Amin as well from the Commonwealth Development Corporation, where she's the Director of Climate Change and Value Creation. We are waiting, we hope, to be joined by Jagjit Singh Samin, who is the Director of Investment and Finance at the International Solar Alliance. And if he is able to join us shortly, that will be wonderful, and he will join in. So I'm just going to hand over to Kanika. And Kanika, thank you very much indeed.
Thank you. Well, you've set a very high bar and very high expectations for this chairing, but thank you very much for having me. And the topic that we're discussing today is what I spend most of my time thinking about, especially since we've been locked in for so long now. But I think that it's also of particular importance at the moment, as we're going to see two kinds of push and pull phenomena play out. One, we will see a lot more public spending happen sort of already happening, but also it happen in the coming months, which kind of offers an opportunity. But also, especially in developing countries, but also around the world, this huge kind of competing goals and competing priorities for this development spending, right? So of course, the primary among them being health, but also many other things, especially with the related economic downturn that we are seeing. But I also think that there's been a lot of examples of comparison between spending now and spending after the 2008 crisis. And I think that it's important to think about what provoked or what have been the triggers for the current economic crisis and the one that we saw in 2008. And I think that the uniqueness of the crisis that is on our hands now, while of course an economic crisis kind of looks and feels the same and is just as tragic regardless of its circumstances, the kind of existential threats that have resulted in the current crisis open the door for integrating, thinking about existential threats writ large when we think about financing. And that's not something that happened in 2008. In 2008, there was a lot of focus on strengthening financial controls, on better regulation, but it wasn't necessarily thinking about threats and risks in the way that we will think about them now. And I think that this is a really important juncture as well, where it's not just about mobilizing capital for green investments like solar, wind, electric mobility, etc., but it's really about overall thinking about how do you green investments, how do you green financial regulation. And I think that, of course, the UK is a shining example of a country that's leading the way on that with a lot of the efforts on the NGFS, etc. To frame today's discussion about India-UK collaboration, I think it's important to think about what are the sort of the comparative advantages of these two countries, right? So I like to think of India as kind of, say, the poster child for market-based energy transition. And this is because if you really think about clean energy markets, we are the largest clean energy market that will be on offer. We're already a very large market, but just in terms of scale, where there will be private sector participation, there will be international capital flows. There is, of course, in terms of scale, we can't compete with China, but in terms of market design, this is really a pure play market, not, unlike what is happening in China. So I think that in a way there is, perhaps in terms of that market curve, India is a bit further ahead and has a lot of lessons for developing countries around the world. The UK, on the other hand, from my point of view, has its comparative advantage lying in terms of being kind of the heart and focal point of international financial services. And so I like to think of it as a funnel for private capital. And then to think of India as the leader of developing countries that are going to then be the recipients of what flows through this funnel. And I think that interconnectivity, therefore, is why today's webinar is so important. So I think that if we keep that in mind in terms of the opportunity for collaboration, thinking of as all private flows, or well, a lot of private flows flow through the UK, and then a lot of them will flow to India, but also therefore to other countries that are going to kind of follow in the same kind of footsteps of market-based approaches. That should kind of be where we think of innovative solutions for collaboration between these two countries, but then also between, the global north and the global south at large. So I will stop at that in terms of just, to frame today's discussion, and maybe turn first to Peter to hear from him, and then we'll turn to Amal, and then we can have a more free-flowing discussion.
Okay, thank you very much, and thanks for the opportunity to participate in this panel on such an important, and as we've just heard, timely topic. I'm really someone who works more on the political economy of energy transitions, and so my entry point here really is to focus on the governance of finance for renewable energy, and I guess particularly in our discussions today focused on solar. And really just in these few minutes I want to draw out three different elements of this. One is what I call rebalancing power, a second is steering finance, and a third is governing innovation. So what do I mean by those? The first one, rebalancing power, and I mean that in a sort of literal and energetic sense, as in rebalancing the energy mix towards lower carbon energy sources, but also politically, and there I really mean undoing the power of incumbent actors or actors that might be resisting shifts towards a lower carbon economy. So for it to make a contribution to tackling climate change, which I take as one of the key drivers here, solar clearly needs to displace rather than merely add to the energy mix, and to add to a still, largely fossil fuel dominated energy mix. And this is clearly a huge challenge, given that solar represents, according to some figures at least, just 3.6% of overall power generation in India. So we need to redirect bilateral, multilateral and private finance, as we were just saying, as well as fossil fuels towards solar. So there needs to be this shift in the allocation of finance. And I noted, according to some figures, in India, oil and gas subsidies were up by over 65% between 2017 and the end of 2019 to over $10 billion US, while renewable energy subsidies were down by 35% to $1.5 billion at the end of the financial year 2019. Though again, they might now pick up. On the UK side, given that we're talking about this as a relationship, the UK Export Finance currently oversees up to £6 billion worth of fossil fuel investments, much of which has gone to some of the most prolific and powerful oil and gas companies in the world. Now, there's some hope in the UK that there'll be an announcement soon about that shifting. So there's important shifts that need to take place in both sides of this relationship. I think there clearly cost considerations are going to be vital about choices about which energy trajectories to go down, and in making the economic case, I think when comparing with fossil fuels, emphasis needs to be placed on the health and environmental impacts of energy sources like coal in particular, as well as some of the benefits, particularly for poorer communities and groups, around things like solar cooking to address indoor air pollution, one of the other slower moving crises, if you like, that we're facing. And so we need to consider seriously questions of planning and infrastructure to reduce energy demand in the first place, as well as trying to be more efficient by design, if you like, in reducing the need for ever more energy generation. And so in the Indian context, I think there's a key role for the Planning Commission here, but also perhaps redressing some of these historic imbalances between the Ministry of Power, for example, and the Ministry for New and Renewable Energy in terms of who gets to decide on different energy futures. So that's the first point about rebalancing power. Secondly, in terms of steering finance, this takes me back to work I was doing in India more than 10 years ago now on the clean development mechanism and carbon finance as one of the possible levers for trying to accelerate transitions to a lower carbon economy. And one of the key challenges at the time, and it'll be interesting to hear what others think about whether this is still the case, was how to use finance to address regional disparities. And at that time, a lot of the money was flowing to Tamil Nadu, Maharashtra, Karnataka, Gujarat, Rajasthan. In other words, places where there were active industrial sectors, where there were strong governance arrangements, attractive policies to pull inward private capital in particular. I guess one of the questions, if we're trying to spread the benefits of this clean energy revolution, is what this would look like in somewhere like Bihar or Jharkhand or somewhere, another poorer state perhaps, what industrial policies and strategies might be required to try and de-risk some of the finance or to make it more attractive for private capital to invest in those places. And perhaps there's a role for the Clean Energy Fund in trying to do that. And my final point really is about governing innovation in a way that user perspectives are incorporated more systematically. And so here I want to put emphasis on the process, because I do think, as we've already heard, there's an opportunity to build an industrial base around solar in terms of manufacturing, jobs, installation, and so on. And I think there's a key role for donors, given that's one of the things we're talking about today, in trying to secure some of these benefits, supporting the development of industrial policy, helping local governments, state governments to capture some of the benefits that go beyond what the National Solar Mission is able to achieve. But one thing I do think we need to think about is how we build the public and donor base and the networks to try and support all of this. Sometimes in these stories about the success of particular innovations, think of solar home systems, the story gets told of heroic individuals and market actors leading the way. But often behind that there's a lot of public money and agents and actors trying to support this and roll it out in more inclusive ways. And I think that's going to be something we need to deal with here. And also for solar, I think to really address questions of poverty, and I mean poverty more generally, not just energy poverty, we do need to think about making sure that its expansion at sites of production doesn't come with issues of land dispossession or violations of tribal rights, or other things that have attended the expansion of wind in some parts of India, for example. And of course, there are issues of waste and handling of toxic chemicals that potentially exacerbate certain inequalities. So we need to think all of these things through really carefully, as well as issues of cost in terms of who bears the costs of solar electricity, tariffs, decentralized energy distribution, etc. So for me, a lot of this is about what's called the just transition discussion. And I think governance is key to making sure we can make sure that this transition is as just and inclusive for all as it possibly can be. And I'll stop there.
Thank you, Peter. I think that you've kind of posed a lot of the really important and relevant questions in terms of, I think that we've done well to kind of bring renewables from the margin to the mainstream, but we continue, and so we have quite a fairly large market, like I was saying, but it continues to be a young market. And so a lot of these questions, especially a lot of the trade-offs, remain unaddressed, and we haven't taken a view on them one way or the other. And I think that I'd like to also hear from Amal, especially because I know that the CDC group does have interests in India. And so how are you kind of looking at the market and sort of balancing some of these aspects that Peter talked about?
Thank you. And thanks very much for the invitation. I think, I just on that last point, the just transition is essential. And I'll come back to that and say a bit about what we're doing CDC group with partners on financing roadmaps for a just transition. Because we see that as a really essential activity now to ensure that finance does flow into the right types of investments that really will bring the social economic benefits of the transition to net zero, as well as resilient economies. But before I do, I also wanted to flag, I think, this is a very timely discussion. It comes not long after the recent UK India economic and finance dialogue, where Chancellor Rishi Sunak and Finance Minister Nirmala Sitharaman agreed actually quite an ambitious set of actions for further collaboration on this agenda, very much recognising, the opportunity to build back better and, UK-India collaboration in that context. And within that, I mean, there was some very clear new announcements around the UK-India partnership on infrastructure and financing, and also the announcement of a new forum, UK-India Sustainable Finance Forum, to engage on exactly these issues that both you, Kanika, and Peter just referred to. How to help green the financial system, as well as also increase the investments that will be needed for a just low carbon transition. And so, I think the areas in which, we can bring relative areas of comparative advantage, if you like, bringing the expertise from the City of London, but also the very strong innovation that India has in, whether it's in fintech or other technology innovations, clearly very strong opportunities for collaboration to enable the transition that will be needed. And I think as we look ahead to 2021, we do obviously all hope that, as you said, Kanika, that all the public finance that will now go into economies around the world, that really is directed in a smart way to build back better for a greener, more resilient, but also more socially inclusive and just paths of development. And so I'll just come back to the point I made at the beginning, the work we're doing now with a few partners. In fact, we're working with the National Institute of Public Finance and Policy in India, the Observer Research Foundation, the Climate Bonds Initiative, and LSE Grantham Institute. And I know, in fact, your own organisation, Kanika, have been doing some really interesting work on this and financing the just transition. So, very much want to collaborate with yourselves as well. Recognizing that there are many potential opportunities, but if there's not more of a strategy or a sort of a very deliberate focus on those, actually we could end up with a lot of disadvantages coming out of the transition. And as Peter rightly said, the sort of just transition is going to be essential. It's critical to overcome political economy barriers, but also to ensure that those potential opportunities can really be focused on. And so what we're doing, recognizing that there of course is a very strong role for governments and policymakers when thinking through how to build back better and what the just transition may look like, and how to deliver on that. We also see there's a role for financial institutions and investors. And in fact, so LSE, the partner here in the UK we're working with, has actually developed a just transition finance roadmap for the UK, and has been engaging with the banking sector and potential investors who are increasingly starting to want to see that these investments that they make moving forward, that they are delivering on the social and economic benefits associated with the climate agenda. And because if we don't focus on this, we'll end up not just with stranded assets, but stranded communities. So, really essential to ensure, and I think as Peter said, when we look at, obviously India, Bihar is, the biggest coal producing state. And so, how do we ensure that new economic opportunities are brought to that state as part of this transition? And so the work we're doing and the roadmap that we're developing, we're at early stages, I have to say, but, very much want to build on existing conversations, strengthen dialogue between different players within the financial sector, potential investors, existing investors, including international sources of finance and capital, such as ourselves, CDC Group. So, you know, I think it's a very timely but also incredibly important conversation to be having right now as we look ahead into 2021 and look to build that better.
Thank you. I think that there's something that both you and Peter touched upon, and I'd like to unpack that a little bit more around kind of the inequitous distribution of the energy transition within India. And so if we can just talk a little bit about, you know, where the sun shines kind of everywhere, but, you know, just in terms of, you know, it isn't just really about the irradiation levels, but also about the attractiveness of capital, you know, your counterparties of the electricity utilities and their financial health, which, you know, for the most part is rather poor, and is then further worse in some, and then, you know, so things like that. And then I think that, so what I want to talk about is maybe two things. One is, what is a role of collaboration in kind of thinking about bringing up the laggards, so to speak, and so de-risking is one thing that Peter mentioned, and, you know, is really perhaps the first port of call, but also in kind of systemic solutions around better integration of renewables and things like that. So that's the first thing that I want to talk about. And then the second thing is around the political economy itself. And would it be that if you were to extend the value chain and indigenize it, that you'd be able to capture more benefits, and that would make perhaps the transition more equitous across states? Or does there really need to just be kind of cash in hand transfer for loss of revenues because you're moving away from certain types of fuels and towards other types of fuels that are in different parts of the country? So I'd just like to maybe get views from both of you. So Peter, do you want to go first?
Yeah, these are big questions. I'm not sure I have all the answers, but I can have a go at some of them. I mean, I think, yeah, obviously the just transition is a huge thing. And one book I just finished reading, I don't know if you've all read it, is a book by Sanjeet Pai on total transition, and he's sort of spends a lot of time in coal communities in India talking about precisely these issues, like the extent of people's dependence on coal in different ways. You know, not just the big utilities and those that involved directly in mining, but the sort of the small scale sellers of coal carrying bundles of coal on bikes and to smaller scale markets, and the whole sort of chain of reliance and dependence and the provision of health services and education in some places. And there's a whole infrastructure around coal which you need to think about. And so I think a key sort of starting point is sort of managed decline. If we're serious about having to accelerate the move away from that type of energy source, you know, what's the plan? What's the time scale? Really think about jobs and retraining. I mean, that has to be the key thing. And there is a really important role for donors there. And I've seen what they're doing more recently in India, but other work I've done in Kenya and places. That's one of the key things they do. It's about training up solar technicians to install things, to repair them where they go wrong, to try and build up more informal economies around those things as well, about the exchanging of components and materials and so on. So it's really about trying to get that assemblage in place all the way up. And so at government level, it can be about support. It can be about the level of VAT on imported equipment, if that's one of the key things. But I think from both sort of national, state and state level, it has to be about what's the industrial strategy for trying to build up a viable industrial base here, so that materials can be produced as locally as possible, that you're training people to sort of play key parts in all of this, and, you know, a phased plan, because, you know, one way or other, it looks like finance is moving out of coal, or certainly international finance. You know, that's happening more quickly in some parts of the world than others. So either this is going to happen in quite a disruptive and shock-like manner, or you try and plan for it and minimize some of those shocks and make sure that the transition occurs in a slightly more orderly, and, as I was trying to emphasize, inclusive way. And I think that's absolutely key. So I think there is a role for, you know, de-risking, as I said, trying to make things more attractive to private capital. But you also need to be a little bit careful with that. One thing I've seen in Kenya and other places is that sometimes that assumes that the state takes on all the risks. They have to do all the initial planning, they do all the retraining.
Did we lose Peter?
If that's going to work effectively. Did I freeze slightly then? Yeah. I don't know which bits you heard and which bits you didn't, but yeah, that's what I was trying to say. I think it needs to be a partnership in terms of the de-risking. It can't just be about states have to put all the infrastructures in place, take all the risks financially, deal with any negative social knock-on effects, and then the private investment can just come in and clean up on the rollout of the technology. I think it has to be a genuine conversation and genuine partnership, but I do think there's a really important role for donors in that as well.
I couldn't agree more with that point, actually, because I think that especially, if you just to look at what has already happened in India, is despite, the rampant issues around the power sector, like legacy issues in the power sector, we've been able to drive a lot of the decarbonizing of this power sector, or the new renewable energy capacity addition, primarily through this collaborative private sector-led approach. Of course, there's been, strategic use of public money, but if that public money was going into kind of do project financing or into doing, take on every risk as it were, there isn't enough public money in the world for it, right? Whether domestic or international. So I think that the point that you're making around using it strategically to have a significant kind of leverage is a really important one. And I think that's something that Amal, you can speak to as well.
Yes, absolutely. And, fully agree with the point about the need for partnership, collaboration, to rethink and redesign what we mean by, sharing of risks and rewards between public, private sector, in a way that ensures that, governments can't take on all the risks and are not necessarily very good at taking on certain types of risks. So the private sector should be incentivized to take on some risk, but also then will need to make a financial return in line with those risks. Very much just want to draw on one example of a CDC investment in India, where IANA, it's a renewable energy platform that we have invested in to invest in new utility scale renewable energy. And a very important component of that was to provide skills, skilling and training. And actually we partnered with DFID, the DFID office in India, to provide training for 400 women, actually. So very focused on inclusiveness from the gender perspective as well, trying to create, provide skills and training to create good jobs for women in the renewable sector in India. And that's a platform that we've been working with over the last few years. And actually it's really has helped shape what is our new climate strategy at CDC, where we've got three main pillars of our strategy. One is net zero emissions, one is adaptation and resilience to climate impacts. But the third one actually is the just transition, a specific focus on how we can work with companies, businesses to provide the necessary skills or retraining to enable this socially just transition for workers and also communities. And in that we see as there is a role there for the private sector, and that's our main partners and clients are private sector, but of course engaging with governments and the government, whether it's state level, central level, setting the right kind of framework to help facilitate, enable this transition over time will be needed to bring more private sector investors in a way that they will support the just transition as well. So I do think it's very much about collaboration and partnership, and recognizing that as we think about bringing in the climate related solutions that are needed, they also have to be, central to those have to be people and people's livelihoods, both now and in the future.
Yeah. Emma?
Kanika, I'm not sure if you can see the questions, the chat.
I can.
Yeah, I've seen one question. Yeah.
Okay, I just wanted to check. Then I'll leave it to you.
We'll come to it. I actually wanted to cover one other thing before we come to the question. And I think that that's the point that we were just discussing around, whether there is what Ayana is trying to do, and then there's a few other examples of that, but how do you go from something like that happening as the exception to the rule itself? And as you know, if you've been watching the Indian market at all, we our kind of national obsession at the moment with the renewable story is how do you get it to be affordable and with the lowest cost of a unit of renewable electricity. And we've done well with that approach, for a developing country to it has to be the economics that will drive this kind of large scale adoption. So I think that it was well advised, and the reverse auction process, etc., is something that has helped build transparent markets. Again, kind of preemptively correcting for some of the other issues that the power sector has had in the past. But as a result of that, you're not able to do at scale some of these considerations around local value capture or, supporting indigenous manufacturing or skilling and things like that. So other examples of either how you've been able to do that while staying competitive in India, and then Peter, for you, if there are examples of your work in other countries that can almost act as kind of entry points. But also the last and important kind of connection to today's discussion on UK-India is how can government to government collaborations almost act as a driver or lever to advance some of these just transition topics. So Amal, if you wanted to go first.
Yes, thank you. So, I think we are seeing renewables as being competitive. And I think, one of the challenges, however, particularly when we're talking obviously about utility scale renewables, is ensuring that there is sufficient focus on the grid infrastructure. And, that's not unique to renewables in that, many centralized electricity plants can actually end up being backed down because the grid infrastructure is insufficient. But that becomes even more important when you're thinking about intermittent renewables such as wind or large-scale solar, utility-scale solar, which isn't necessarily intermittent in the same way, but is harder to store, or it doesn't necessarily provide electricity overnight so easily. Although I think it's that technology is improving quite dramatically. So bringing in better grid infrastructure and storage technologies that will be really essential to actually not just increase renewables, but actually increase the economics of those. But a lot of those investments will need to take place anyway in India, even if there wasn't a shift to renewables. So why not develop your grid infrastructure in a way that is going to be much more modern, cleaner, bring in newer technologies, is more in line with innovation, which India is extremely good at innovating. So and I think that's really the challenge here, and and how you assess and that can really impact on what is the economics of renewables, intermittent renewables in particular.
Yeah, Peter.
Yeah, so I think the question of affordability is really interesting. I guess one thing I would do, those of you involved in trying to push solar, is to try and reframe the conversation a bit, because it tends to be, can we afford solar? I guess one of the questions is, can we afford to carry on a coal-dependent pathway? Because depending on how those costings are done in terms of health and other impacts, then it's huge, right? I mean, coal looks cheaper because you're not including a lot of those impacts. Those things are not taken into account when you're comparing energy pathways. And so that, for me, that has to be a key entry point to sort of say, look at the huge health impacts that it's having on communities working in those industries or living near those extraction plants. So I think we need to sort of think slightly more broadly about that question of affordability. you know, obviously there's the questions of grid connectivity, there's questions of feed-in tariffs and all of those sorts of things, and there is a role for national government to support those things, and to speak to your question, bilateral cooperation. I think there's a lot of experience around, you know, policies that can support renewables, including solar, around the world, that the UK and others can draw on. And of course, the UK also has some experience of just transitions. We had one sort of moving away from coal, and that wasn't necessarily done in the best or most inclusive way. So we do have ideas about the need for regional regeneration, regional development, how to sort of support people retraining for other jobs. You know, we've got good and bad experiences, I think, of our own transitions that might help inform some of the conversations taking place in India. And there has been some work recently doing surveys with workers in the fossil fuel sector, including oil workers in the UK context, and, you know, people involved in the gas industry. And in most cases, very high percentages of workers are willing to and keen to move out of that sector and into other sectors, but only under certain circumstances around retraining and, you know, job security and all those sorts of things. So it's not that there's some commitment and resistance on the part of people working in those sectors necessarily. It's a question of, you know, how can this be done in the most effective way. And I guess the other thing in terms of the UK's role in supporting what's going on in India, I think the UK is obviously a key actor in the World Bank and other institutions, multilateral institutions, who are putting a lot of money into energy sector. Some of it's still going into high carbon sectors, unfortunately, but a lot of it still, you know, going into support for solar policies, the scaling up renewable energy and the climate investment funds and things like that. So the UK can use its power and its influence and its vote to try and steer policies in more productive and favourable directions in India and elsewhere. So I think that's another sort of key part of that relationship that we could keep in the picture.
Yeah. I think with that, we can turn to some of the questions that have come in. They're both quite good questions. So one of the things I had said kind of upfront was how the competing uses for development finance or for even, you know, public spending within the countries is going to increase. And we often think, especially internationally, we think about the intersectionality between energy and climate. But we don't necessarily think as much about the intersectionality between energy and everything else, right? So energy and agriculture, for instance, is an important intersectionality, especially in the context of India. And we have quite a large solar irrigation pump set program. And so Aditi asks about how do you kind of accelerate the flow of capital into that program while making sure, so one is, I think, how do you create a market for it? And I think earlier today, Peter, you touched upon kind of clean cooking as well. And what we've seen is in some of these underserved markets, like clean cook stoves or solar irrigation pump sets, or even home systems, et cetera, there's been so much kind of, you know, grant capital that's come in that it's ended up distorting markets rather than making them. And because in these decentralized markets, the cost or the transaction size is so small, the cost of due diligence is disproportionately high. And so we don't necessarily see the same kind of private capital interest. So how do you really kind of accelerate the flow of capital into these smaller niche markets, which can actually have a really significant role in the way that solar is kind of integrated into kind of, you know, daily life, so to speak?
Kanika, I'm going to ask, if you don't mind, for Peter and Amal to hold that question and maybe take a couple from the audience, just because there's some really interesting questions here, and I think, is that okay if we pick up on those as well?
Yeah, but that is an audience question.
Oh, sorry.
That's the first one.
Do that one.
Yeah.
Who do you want to address?
Shall I go or?
Yeah, you know, you go, Amal.
Okay. Yeah, no, I think this is really important, particularly when we think about these types of technologies, often quite small scale technologies that are going to be needed, not just to decarbonize sectors, but very importantly to enable adaptation and ensure resiliency of sectors, particularly the agriculture sector. I mean, as we know, water availability is becoming, you know, a really critical issue in India, with changing monsoon patterns and, you know, all the implications for the agriculture sector. So these kinds of technologies, solar irrigation, are absolutely the sort of innovative approaches that we need to be financing much more of and scaling up. And that's very much something that we as CDC Group are already investing in India and other countries in Africa. Also, though, I think it's important to highlight that particularly when we think about these types of solutions that are more focused on the adaptation and resiliency side of the agenda, I think up until recently, there's been a perception that adaptation resilience is a public sector activity, it's a government activity. But we know that governments cannot do that on its own. I mean, there's absolutely no way, given but one, the scale of the financing that was required, but also the innovation that is required that really comes from entrepreneurs and particularly small and medium-sized enterprises that can bring forward exactly these types of technologies and services such as solar irrigation, drip technology. And actually last week, I mean, it's a great question in a way, because last week we at CDC Group with a number of partners, but also the UK FCDO, we hosted one of the events at Financing Commons Summit, one of the high-level events on how to accelerate investment in adaptation and resilience, and also announced a new initiative or collaborative to bring together DFIs with others that are interested in how we do really accelerate these types of investments. And particularly given their small scale, but also relatively new as we think about the types of business solutions they're providing, that we really need to work together to actually build out the pipeline, whilst governments create more of the incentives, policy and regulatory incentives to bring these forward, but work with those who entrepreneurs and those who are developing the technologies to accelerate them. It's absolutely essential. We can't wait. I mean, in a way, we're sort of almost 20 years behind where the renewable sector is now, and we cannot wait to bring these types of solutions forward, given that climate impacts are already happening all over the world, but particularly in a country like India.
Yeah, I also agree that food and agriculture is a critical sector, and there's a lot of talk about climate smart agriculture and many sort of global and other initiatives in this area. I think the entry point here, as you've been emphasizing, is things like solar irrigation and pumps and trying to sort of decarbonize some of the inputs and the technologies that are used. Because that's not the way it's often getting talked about at the international level at the moment, where it's often about pushing biotechnologies of GM technologies, which have a fairly controversial history in India, or biochar or other sort of big tech solutions. And I think that's just one small part of the picture here. I think we need to think about much more about, can we reduce the energy inputs and decarbonize those energy inputs, but also it's an opportunity to think more broadly around fertilizer use, which is obviously one of the key sources of emissions in that sector. And again, it's an opportunity in trying to decarbonize, to tackle some of the other issues that face food and agriculture in India and elsewhere, which is often about the overuse of chemicals and the high levels of indebtedness that farmers experience, which again, as we know, there's been episodes of farmer suicides, etc. in the past. So, can we use this as an opportunity to try and change the way food gets produced in ways that reduce a whole range of other impacts as well as our lower carbon? And so, yeah, I don't have much to add on the financing side. I agree with a lot of what Amal has said.
Maybe we'll turn to the next question. I think we've covered it a bit. Sorry, I think my email blanked out for a moment, but yeah, it says, is the urgency of action picture on financing and the financiers? But I think that the question is equally also, are the financiers seeing this as an opportunity, that as policy and regulation shifts to support cleaner energy, is this really a kind of a race to make some of the early, or sort of, get the gains of early movement in that space? So what is your perception in terms of, how you see the overall finance community reacting to these opportunities? Amal? Yeah,
so I think, certainly when you look here in London and the City of London, I participated in an event last week, the Green Horizons Summit, which was convened by the City of London, the Green Finance Institute, and also the World Economic Forum. And I mean, the level of interest in this agenda is huge. I mean, you know, from the top level of these financial institutions. And so I think, you know, and as we said earlier at the beginning of this session, the opportunities for collaboration between, you know, City of London and Indian financial sector, you know, there's great opportunity there to collaborate, to learn from each other, to you know, work through what are sort of good practice or best practice, emerging best practice, both on green financing, but also how to address climate risk. Two aspects of climate risk, both the sort of transition risk, like the risk that, you know, that certain assets and I might say communities, as I said earlier, could become stranded in this transition. What does that mean for the financial sector? And also the physical impacts of climate change. What does that mean for economic activities and sectors? And, you know, and so this has been picked up by the Task Force on Climate-Related Financial Disclosure, the TCFD, which actually just last week, the UK's Chancellor announced that would become mandatory for all listed companies and financial services here in the UK. And I know that's been part of the discussion between, you know, in this UK-India dialogue, and the Reserve Bank of India now thinking to perhaps join the Network for Greening the Financial Sector, which I think is a really valuable network that brings central banks together. I think around 75 now, who are thinking through all these challenges and issues and how best to address those collectively, you know, this peer-to-peer engagement. And, you know, and as central banks start to integrate these and take actions in response to the climate crisis, then, you know, I think that will then be critical to work closely with the financial sector, different financial services, to ensure that they're, you know, fully understand what this means, have the right capabilities to address these issues. And that's very much something we as CDC Group are doing. We did a training earlier this year in India. Well, it was an online training for the financial sector, financial institutions in India, to help share understanding and build awareness of what the TCFD is calling for and some of the implications for the Indian financial sector. So there's many drivers for, you know, to finance more green, but there's also a number of drivers that are requiring greater integration of climate risk that will also start to shift portfolios into those types of solutions that are going to be consistent with the transition in response to the climate crisis.
Yeah. Peter, did you want to come in on that as well?
Yeah, just quickly. I mean, I think the question of urgency is obviously hugely important, and I think the speaker asked, you know, is the financial community reacting with the right degree of urgency? I think clearly not, not yet. Firstly, because as I said before, I think the challenge is redirecting finance. There's still massive amounts of public and private finance still pouring into the fossil fuel sector. And until that's reversed, the challenge just gets bigger and bigger. So it can't be a question of us adding solar to a mix which is largely moving in the wrong direction. So there's a big challenge about redirecting and consciously moving, trying to actively reduce fossil fuel subsidies, for example, and redirect them towards the sorts of things we're talking about. There is clearly that bigger challenge that Amal has alluded to. And I think the work of UNEP in all of this about how to green the financial system is really useful, like thinking about where are the different lever points, whether it's around banking regulation, disclosure, risk assessments, all of those things. There's so many financial tools and instruments that we need to revisit from the point of view of climate and you know, sustainability more broadly. So I think that's an important part of the picture. The other thing, though, I think is also putting limits on some of the use of financial mechanisms for potentially quite regressive ends. And here I'm thinking about the financialization of climate risks around crop insurance or weather derivatives or catastrophe bonds and these sorts of things. So there are some ways in which the financial community is working on climate change, but in ways that I don't think are going to benefit a lot of poorer groups in particular. So there's also that sense of putting some boundaries and some limits about how we use finance to tackle climate change.
Great. I think we have a few more questions which we can do quite rapidly. So maybe we'll do like one-line answers in terms of what are the big regulatory hurdles in India for renewables finance. If I had to take a stab at that answer, I would say, well, it wouldn't really be a regulatory hurdle, but it would be kind of the poor quality of the counterparty. And this is not just because, there's payment delays, there's threats to renegotiation of contracts, and then there's actual curtailment of power that is generated. And I think that is, to me, the number one risk. But if, Amal, if you wanted to come in on, if you pick just one risk or one hurdle, what would that be?
Yeah, no, this is interesting. I actually did my PhD on looking at regulatory change within the power sector of India and South Africa, actually at SPRU at the University of Sussex. So this is a fascinating topic for me, and I'd love to talk for a long time about it. But I do think, going back to the point I made earlier, I think the challenge of ensuring that there's enough investment going into the grid infrastructure that is going to be needed to provide a quality service, prevent blackouts. The number of people that have, diesel gensets because they can't rely on the grid. And that's not really an issue of generation, certainly not from my experience. Okay, I did finish my PhD in 2000, so 20 years ago. But I'm sure some things have changed, but I think, I think getting the regulation to incentivize more investment in smarter grids, smart grid technologies, storage as part of that, electric vehicle charging as well, really trying to regulate in a way that incentivizes that type of investment that then will also encourage more intermittent renewables, I think will be essential.
Yeah, Peter?
Yeah, I don't have anything. Yeah, I don't have anything to add to that.
Okay, good. Emma, you had a question for our speakers as well.
Yes, I have a sort of rather technical question for Amal. So as I understand it, CDC has recently committed to put 40% of its investment in low-income countries, which is quite bold. There's all sorts of additional risks. There's also, I think, quite a competitive search between DFIs for prospective investment outlets. And I just wondered about to pick up Pete's point about states, let's say Chhattisgarh, Jharkhand, some of the poorer states and states with a less, well, Chhattisgarh does, but Jharkhand a less strong industrial base. And I wondered if CDC, this is a constant problem for donors, where you get to a country like India that's incredibly wealthy and has a tremendous amount of its own resources, of course, and certainly doesn't want donors turning up being paternalistic. But it seems then the classic middle income problem is, what do you do with those poor areas in middle income countries? I wondered whether CDC had a heightened appetite for risk in poorer places, and whether it could regionally differentiate within somewhere like India.
So we do have now, we have two types of capital, if you like. We have our growth capital, but we also now have a new, what we call catalyst capital, that will allow us to take on more risk or take on a lower return on investment. So that, and that can, is likely to be prioritized in the, to do the more sort of innovative things, where there's clear additionality, if you like, in all markets, and deliver particularly around the sort of, climate and, the types of investments needed to sort of, move, support economic transformation. But also in those countries, the much harder markets where the private sector is much more, much weaker, where capital markets don't exist or extremely weak. So we do have that in our toolbox, and that's something that's being developed in different sectors. We just, for example, agreed internally a new forestry, sustainable forests and land use catalyst strategy, where we hope to be able to do more, particularly in Africa, where there is widespread deforestation, but also potential opportunities. I mean, a lot, particularly in the sustainable landscapes agenda, can bring a lot of jobs, good new jobs in rural areas. So, you know, but it's very hard sector to invest in. So, you know, that's where we see our catalyst strategy is enabling that. But certainly, yes, and that would be where, you know, how we would work in the sort of poorer states as well in India.
Great. We're almost at the top of our hour, so I'm going to actually use one of the questions that's come in to do wrap up as well, because I think it's a great question to kind of leave the audience with. So the question is, what are some of the most exciting examples of international partnerships to catalyze financing that you'd like to point out, and for something for everyone to ponder about? If you could just take one, and then so that we have a little bit of time for wrap up.
Shall I go?
Peter, if you wanted to go first. Either way is fine.
Okay, yeah, no, I can do. I mean, I don't know if I could point to one. I think, I mean, at lots of different levels, there's people doing good work. I mean, sort of you've got the type 3 partnerships, REAP and things like that, the Renewable Energy Efficiency Partnership doing their work. I think C40 initiatives like that, trying to draw cities into making plans and trying to support solar more effectively. Have a lot to do. Obviously, we were going to hear more from the International Solar Alliance. I think sort of stuff they're doing is really important and valuable. And then also there's, you know, alliances around particular interventions like the Clean Cooking Alliance and those sorts of things, which are all doing good work. I mean, I think the key challenge with all of these things, and going back to some of the other discussions we've had, is how can we make sure that they're adding value to what's going on already, and that there's genuine ownership over them, that they're not sort of responsive to their own international priorities. And what they're doing in India is just another example or another chapter of the work they're rolling out elsewhere, but genuinely responds to sort of locally identified needs and gaps in the market. I think that's always the real challenge, is to sort of bridge areas where there may otherwise be disconnects. But I don't want to sort of highlight one particular initiative that I think is you know, represents the best, but maybe Amal is brave enough to do that.
No, actually, the opposite. I was planning to say this before you said what you just said, but actually, I'm going to say I'm not going to name a single partnership, because for me, the issue here is any international partnership. It's absolutely essential that it's working effectively at the local level. And I increasingly see this in, you know, all my different roles over my career. And actually, I designed REAP on the behalf of the UK government and launched it, you know, gosh, 18 years ago now, I think, 17 years. And that was built very much from the sort of ground up. It started with regional initiatives to identify what was needed in that particular country or region. For example, we did one in India, but there was also one in East Africa, West Africa. But the point I'm trying to make is that, you know, it's essential. Any partnership has to be effectively working on the ground, delivering change, driving systemic change now. You know, it's no longer incremental change, is no longer, you know, what we need. And that has to be addressing local challenges, local political economy issues, bringing all the relevant expertise and different, you know, areas of, whether it's finance, whether it's bringing public policy makers together to really tackle these issues. And I do think there are several international initiatives, you know, I would highlight that are doing that. But I think I just want to highlight that point, or emphasize that point, which I think resonates exactly with what Peter just said.
Great, thank you. I think this has been, for me, a really interesting and candid discussion. So I'd like to thank both our speakers, but also Emma and the entire group for kind of bringing us all together. I think that the broad takeaways, at least for me, are very clear that any kind of collaboration must be market responsive, and it must keep in mind a just transition rather than kind of just top level political speak. It must really be effective and truly deliver not just economic gains, but also kind of social, or at least even if it's economic gains, but in an inclusive way, not just, you know, kind of at the top level in terms of tariffs. So thank you very much. And with that, I'll hand back over to Emma to close.
Thank you, Kanika. So let me heartily echo all your thanks, and to you, of course. I know we're at the end, so I won't go on for very long. I'd just like to say sorry, Jagjit couldn't make it. We will try again to get somebody from the ISA, and talk particularly then about those external questions and how India, UK both think about, both experience their domestic transitions, experiences, and can bring them together. One, I think I'm going to finish really to echo Pete's point, until we actually stop financing fossil fuels, I mean, nothing would act as a sharpener and a more urgent and a kind of an accelerator to solar than if we gave a 5-year end of term for all fossil fuel investments. So I think that is Pete's point is a really important starting point, and I hope that CDC will use their influence to encourage us all in that direction. But thank you for your expertise and your willingness to talk in such a detailed and expert way today.